CEO froze mid-handshake. He had shaken hundreds of hands that week. Investors, lawyers, politicians. None of them had made his pulse spike like this one. A janitor applicant's hand, calloused, ordinary, attached to a name that should not have existed anymore. "Say your name again," he said. "Marcus," the man repeated, confused by the question. "Marcus Hale." The CEO's grip tightened without him meaning it to. 18 years. 18 years of private investigators, dead-end leads, and a search he had finally, quietly given up on. And now Marcus was standing in his lobby in a janitor's uniform, mop bucket beside him, asking for a job that paid minimum wage, completely unaware that the man interviewing him had spent a fortune trying to find him. The CEO let go of his hand, slowly. "Don't sit down yet, Marcus," he said. "There's something you need to hear first, and it's going to change everything you think you know about your own life." Before we get into this one, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and hit subscribe if you don't want to miss what happens at the end of this story, because trust me, you will not see it coming. Marcus Hale had filled out the same job application 4 times that week, and this was the only one that had actually called him back. The building was the kind of place he used to avoid looking at when he walked past it, all glass and steel and people in suits who moved like they had somewhere important to be. He had not expected to make it past the front desk, let alone be sitting in a waiting area on the executive floor, his work boots leaving faint dust marks on a carpet that probably cost more than his truck. He kept his hands folded in his lap and his eyes on the elevator doors, rehearsing the same 3 sentences he had practiced in his bathroom mirror that morning. Sentences about reliability and hard work and showing up on time, because those were the only things he had left to sell. He did not know the name of the man who was about to interview him. He did not know it would matter more than anything else in his life so far. The receptionist had called him back twice to confirm the spelling of his name before sending him up, which he had thought was strange, but not strange enough to ask about. Marcus assumed it was just how things worked in a building like this, where every detail got triple-checked before anyone let you near the people who signed the checks. He had been a janitor for 9 years, first at a school district that cut his hours, then at a hospital that closed 2 wings and let half its staff go. And now he was 43 years old, raising a daughter alone, applying for a position that most people his age would have considered a step backward. He did not see it that way. A paycheck was a paycheck, and his daughter needed shoes before winter, and pride had stopped being something he could afford a long time ago. He thought about her now, sitting in that waiting area, about the way she had hugged him that morning before school and told him she hoped he got the job, not because it mattered to her what the job was, but because she could tell from his face that it mattered to him. That was the only reason he had ironed his shirt twice and double-checked the bus schedule 3 times the night before, so he would not be even a minute late to something that, as far as he knew, was nothing more than mopping floors for minimum wage. What he did not notice, sitting there with his hands folded, was the security guard near the elevator quietly making a phone call and saying his name into the receiver like it was something urgent, his voice dropping lower with every word, like he was being careful about who might overhear. When the elevator doors opened, a man in his late 50s stepped out instead of calling Marcus up, which was not how these things usually went. The man was tall, gray at the temples, dressed in a suit that fit too well to be off the rack, and he was holding a single sheet of paper in his hand, like it weighed more than it should have. He stopped a few feet from where Marcus was sitting and simply looked at him for a moment longer than felt comfortable, the way a person looks at something they are trying to convince themselves is real. Marcus stood up out of habit, extending his hand the way his father had taught him, and the man took it slowly, his grip firm, but his eyes somewhere far away, somewhere that was not this lobby at all. For one strange second, Marcus thought the man's hand was shaking. "You're Marcus," the man said, not quite a question. "Yes, sir," Marcus answered, already running through what he might have done wrong. He had been on time. He had worn the only clean shirt he owned that did not have a logo on it. He could not think of a single reason for the man to be looking at him like that. Like Marcus was a ghost, standing in a place ghosts were not supposed to be able to stand. A small, uneasy thought crossed his mind, the kind he usually pushed away before it could take root. That maybe this interview had never been about a janitor's position at all. The man introduced himself as Richard Cole, and the name meant nothing to Marcus beyond the gold letters on the building's lobby wall, the same name stamped across half the trucks and warehouses in the county. Richard did not lead him into an interview room. Instead, he asked Marcus to walk with him down a quiet hallway lined with framed photographs, old black and white images of construction sites and groundbreaking ceremonies, men in hard hats shaking hands in front of buildings that did not exist yet. Marcus followed because he did not know what else to do, his mind already drafting an apology for whatever this was about to become. certain that somewhere in his paperwork he had made a mistake that was now costing him the only callback he had gotten in 3 weeks. He tried to think back through every form he had filled out, every box he had checked, wondering if he had listed the wrong reference or written down an old address, anything that might explain why the owner of the company himself was the one walking him down this hallway instead of some assistant from Human Resources. Behind them, the elevator chimed again, and 2 other men in suits stepped out and stopped dead in the hallway when they saw who Richard was walking beside, one of them reaching for his phone before he had even finished crossing the lobby. Richard stopped in front of one photograph near the end of the hallway and stood there without speaking for long enough that Marcus finally looked at it too. It showed a much younger version of Richard standing beside a woman Marcus did not recognize, both of them squinting into the sun outside a hospital entrance, and tucked into the corner of the frame, almost too small to notice, was a date that made something cold move through Marcus's chest before he understood why. It was a date he knew by heart. It was the day he was born. He told himself it had to be a coincidence, the kind of strange overlap that happens in a city of millions of people. But the way Richard was staring at that photograph told him this was not a coincidence at all. And somewhere behind him, he could hear someone whispering on a phone, low and fast, saying words he could not quite make out except for one, repeated twice. His own last name. "I need to ask you something," Richard said quietly, finally turning to face him, "and I need you to answer it honestly, because the rest of your life might depend on what you say next." Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but no words came, because for the first time since walking into this building, he understood that he had not come here for a janitor's job at all, and whatever Richard was about to ask him was going to unravel every single thing he believed he knew about where he came from, and about who had been looking for him this entire time. Richard led Marcus away from the photograph and into a private office at the end of the hallway, closing the door behind them with a quiet click that somehow felt louder than it should have. He gestured for Marcus to sit, but he did not sit down himself. Instead, he stood by the window with his back to the city skyline, holding that same sheet of paper he had carried out of the elevator, turning it over in his hands like he was deciding whether to show it to him at all. Marcus sat on the edge of the chair, his hands resting on his knees, watching the older man's shoulders rise and fall with a breath that looked heavier than it should have for a simple job interview. Whatever was about to happen, Marcus understood now that it had nothing to do with mops or floors or minimum wage, and some part of him wanted to stand up and walk back out the way he had come, before whatever this was could change anything. 26 years ago, Richard said, still facing the window, "I had a son." He let the words sit in the room for a moment before turning around. "His mother and I were not married. We were young and foolish, and when things fell apart between us, she left the city with him before he turned 2, and she made sure I could never find either of them again." His voice did not shake when he said it, but something behind his eyes did, the kind of old grief that never fully heals, only learns to stay quiet. "I hired investigators, 3 different firms over the years. Every lead went cold. I told myself eventually that he was probably better off not knowing a man who let him slip away in the first place." Marcus sat very still, his pulse loud in his own ears, doing math in his head that he did not want to be doing, dates and ages lining up in a way that made his mouth go dry. "I'm not telling you this to make conversation," Richard continued, finally sitting down across from him, setting the paper flat on the desk between them so Marcus could see it was a copy of a birth certificate, old and slightly yellowed at the corners. "I'm telling you because 3 weeks ago, an investigator I had stopped paying years ago called me out of nowhere. He said he had found a hospital record in another state, a birth certificate that had been sealed in an old adoption file, and the mother's name on it matched the woman I had spent half my life trying to find." Marcus looked down at the paper without picking it up, his eyes catching on the name typed in the box for father, a blank space where a name should have been, and then on the date, the exact date he had stared at in that photograph in the hallway only minutes earlier. The room felt smaller than it had a moment ago, the way a space does right before something in it changes for good. "I didn't apply for a job today expecting this," Marcus said quietly, the first full sentence he had managed since sitting down. "I came here because I needed work. I have a daughter. I have bills. I don't know what you want me to say." He meant it as honestly as he had ever meant anything, and for a second he almost laughed at how absurd the morning had become, walking in to mop floors and walking out, possibly, as someone's long-lost son. He thought of his own mother, gone 6 years now, and the way she used to go quiet whenever he asked about his father as a boy, always changing the subject, always finding something urgent to do with her hands, scrubbing a counter that was already clean, or folding laundry that did not need folding. He had stopped asking by the time he was 12, the way kids learn to stop pulling on a door that never opens. He had assumed, the way kids do, that the silence meant there was nothing worth knowing, that maybe his father simply had not wanted them, and he had built a quiet kind of peace around that assumption for 30 years, a peace that was now cracking apart in real time in a stranger's office on the 40th floor of a building he had only ever seen from the outside. Richard reached into a drawer and pulled out a second folder, thinner than the first, and slid it across the desk without opening it. "Before you say anything else, I want you to know I'm not asking you to believe me," he said. "I'm asking for one thing, a DNA test. Done today, privately, through a lab I already have on retainer for exactly this reason. If it comes back negative, I will apologize for taking up your morning, and you will still have the job you came here for. Full pay, full benefits, no questions asked." He paused, and something in his face shifted, the careful composure of a man who had spent decades learning to hide what he felt, cracking just slightly at the edges. "But if it comes back positive, Marcus, there are things you need to know about your mother that she never told you, and about why she ran." Marcus's hands had gone cold somewhere in the last few minutes without him noticing. He thought about asking Richard to repeat himself, just to buy a few more seconds before he had to decide anything. But instead he found himself reaching for the folder, opening it slowly, looking down at consent forms and lab paperwork that suddenly felt like the heaviest thing he had ever held. Outside the office door, he could hear footsteps gathering in the hallway, low voices that did not quite manage to stay as quiet as they meant to. People who worked in this building clearly already sensing that something unusual was happening behind this particular door on this particular morning. He signed his name at the bottom of the form before he let himself think too hard about it. Because some decisions, he realized, were not really decisions at all once you understood what was actually being asked of you. "There's something else," Richard said, his voice dropping lower, almost careful, the way a person speaks right before they hand someone a weight they cannot take back once it's given. "The reason I never stopped looking, even after the investigators told me to, it wasn't only about wanting to know you existed." He stopped there, and for a long moment he simply looked at Marcus, the way someone looks at a door they have waited a very long time to open and are suddenly afraid to walk through. Whatever he had been about to say sat right behind his teeth, and Marcus could see it building there, could see that the next sentence out of this man's mouth was going to be the one that actually mattered, the one that would explain not just who he was, but why none of it had ever been an accident. "If you've ever had a parent, or a stranger you barely knew, misjudge you the second they saw what you did for a living, drop a comment below and tell me about it, because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear that you should never judge a person by the job they happen to be standing in when you meet them. We're just getting started, so stay with us, because what Richard says next is going to change everything Marcus thought he knew about his own family." Richard stood up from his chair and walked back to the window, like he needed the distance from Marcus to say what came next, like the words were easier to release into the glass and the skyline than directly into another person's face. "Your mother didn't leave because of anything I did to her," he said. "I need you to understand that first, because I know how this looks, a rich man's son raised without him, and I know what story you've probably been telling yourself your whole life to make sense of it." Marcus said nothing, his jaw tight, waiting, because whatever story he had told himself was about to be taken apart piece by piece in front of him, and there was nothing he could do but sit there and let it happen. "She left because my own family paid her to," Richard said. "My father specifically. He gave her enough money to disappear and start over somewhere I would never think to look, and he told her if she ever tried to contact me again, he would make sure she lost everything, including you." Marcus felt something shift behind his ribs, a slow, sick understanding spreading through him the way cold water spreads through a cracked glass. He thought of his mother's hands, always moving, always finding something to clean or fold or fix, and he understood now, sitting in this office 26 years later, that those hands had probably shaken every single day of her life, with a secret she was too afraid to ever put down. He thought of the small apartment they had shared when he was growing up, the way she had worked 2 jobs and still found time to sit with him over homework at the kitchen table every night, never once complaining, never once letting him see how hard any of it actually was. He had always assumed that was simply who she was, a woman built for hard work and quiet endurance. But now he understood there had been a reason underneath all of it, a reason she had buried so deep that even at the end, with the cancer taking the last of her strength, she had not been able to fully let it out. She kept the money in a separate account she never touched, Richard continued, untouched for over 2 decades, because she told the investigators investigator when he finally found her last month, that she never wanted it to look like she'd sold you. She wanted you to have it when you were old enough to understand why she ran. But she got sick before she ever found the courage to explain it to you herself. Marcus's hands curled into fists on his knees, not from anger at Richard, but from the sudden, sharp grief of realizing his mother had carried something this heavy entirely alone for his entire childhood and had taken the full weight of it with her when she died. "My father passed 11 years ago," Richard said, finally turning back around to face him. "By the time I learned what he'd done, your mother had already moved twice more, and the trail was cold again. I spent the next decade hiring people who kept telling me the same thing, that some people simply do not want to be found, and I started to believe it, because what else was I supposed to believe after that long?" His voice cracked slightly on the last few words, the first real crack Marcus had heard since they sat down, and for a moment, the most powerful man in this entire building looked exactly like what he was, underneath the suit and the company name on the wall. A father who had spent a quarter of a century quietly grieving a son he had never been allowed to know. Marcus realized, watching him, that he had walked into this building that morning believing he understood exactly what kind of conversation he was prepared to have, and he had been wrong about almost all of it. Before either of them could say anything else, there was a knock at the door, sharp and quick, and a woman in a gray blazer stepped in without fully waiting to be invited, her eyes darting between Richard and Marcus with an expression that made it clear she already knew exactly who Marcus was, or thought she did. "The board is asking for you," she said to Richard. "They've heard there's a personal matter happening on this floor, and given the halberd signing in 2 hours, they want to know if it affects anything." Richard's expression hardened in a way Marcus had not seen yet, something protective and immediate, like a door slamming shut over an old wound before anyone else could get close enough to touch it. "Tell them it doesn't concern the company," he said, "and tell them if anyone on that board has a problem with how I spend my own morning, they can bring it to me directly instead of sending you to ask." The woman hesitated, clearly unused to being spoken to that way, then nodded once and left, but not before glancing back at Marcus one more time, the kind of look that told him this was already not as private as Richard wanted it to be. When the door closed again, Richard exhaled slowly and sat back down, rubbing a hand across his jaw, like he was trying to physically push the last few minutes off his face. "There's going to be a lot of noise about this," he admitted. "People in this building, people on that board, people who have spent years assuming I had no family beyond the company itself. Some of them are not going to like the idea of a janitor walking in off the street and turning out to be my son. Some of them have spent a long time positioning themselves to inherit things that were never theirs to inherit." He looked directly at Marcus then, steady, serious, in a way that made it clear this was not a passing comment, but a warning. "I'm telling you this now because if the test comes back the way I believe it will, you are about to become very important to people who have no interest in your well-being, only in what your existence means for them." Marcus sat with that for a long moment, turning it over, trying to find the part of himself that should have felt excited, or hopeful, or even just relieved, and finding instead a tight, careful kind of dread settling into his chest where those feelings should have been. The same instinct that told him to check the exits in a room before he ever sat down in it. He had walked in that morning worried about minimum wage and bus fare, and whether his boots were clean enough not to track dirt across the lobby. And now, he was being warned about boardroom politics, and people who might see him as a threat before they ever learned a single true thing about him. "I don't want anything from you," he said finally, quietly, and he meant it the way he meant very few things in his life. "I came here for a mop and a paycheck. I didn't come here to take anything from anyone, and I'm not going to start now just because a piece of paper says I share your blood." Richard looked at him for a long time after he said that, something unreadable moving behind his eyes, and then he reached for his phone, dialed a number Marcus could not see, and said 4 words into it that made the room go completely still. "Get me the lab, now." The lab technician arrived within the hour, a quiet, efficient woman who said almost nothing as she swabbed the inside of Marcus's cheek, and then Richard's, sealing each sample in its own labeled bag, like she handled moments this heavy every day of her working life. She told them the results would normally take 3 to 5 business days, but Richard had already arranged for a rush, the kind of arrangement that only happens when money stops being a question a person has to ask. Marcus spent those waiting hours sitting in a small conference room down the hall, a cup of untouched coffee going cold in front of him, his phone buzzing twice with messages from his daughter's school, asking if he could confirm pickup, and he answered yes, without being able to explain to anyone, least of all himself, what was actually happening to his life while he sat there. He thought about calling someone, a friend, anyone, just to say the words out loud and make them feel real, but he realized he did not know how to begin a sentence that started with the man interviewing him for a janitor's job might be his father. It was almost 5 in the evening when Richard walked back into that conference room, holding a single sealed envelope, his face face unreadable in a way that made Marcus's stomach drop before a single word had been spoken. He set the envelope on the table between them and did not open it right away, sitting down across from Marcus the same way he had that morning, except now there was no pretense left between them at all. No job application, no interview questions, nothing but two men and a piece of paper that was about to answer a question one of them had been asking for 26 years. "I want you to open it," Richard said quietly. "Whatever it says, I want it to be your hands that find out first, not mine." Marcus's fingers were not steady when he reached for it, and for a moment he simply held it without breaking the seal, aware of how strange it was that something this small could hold the weight of an entire life inside it. He opened it slowly, unfolded the single page inside, and read the words at the top before he let himself process anything else. The percentage printed in plain black ink, 99.9, the kind of number that did not leave room for doubt or hope or any soft version of an answer. He looked up at Richard, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. The silence stretching out between them filled with 26 years of a question finally answered in a conference room on the 40th floor of a building Marcus had once been afraid to even walk past. Richard's eyes were wet, and he did not try to hide it, did not turn away or clear his throat or pretend it was something else. He simply let the tears sit there on the face of a man who had built an empire and somehow still felt, in this exact moment, like the smallest and most uncertain version of himself he had been in decades. "I'm sorry," Richard said, his voice breaking fully now. "I'm sorry for every birthday I missed. Every year I let other people's silence convince me to stop looking. Every single day you grew up without knowing there was someone out there who would have given anything to be in the room." Marcus did not know what to say, so for a long moment he said nothing, sitting with the paper still in his hands, feeling something inside his chest that he could not yet name. Grief and relief, and something that felt dangerously close to forgiveness, all tangled together at once. He thought of his daughter, waiting for him to pick her up from school in a few hours, completely unaware that her father had walked into a building that morning, believing he was applying for a janitor's job, and was walking out as the son of one of the wealthiest men in the city. He thought of his mother again, and for the first time since she had passed, he felt something other than the simple, uncomplicated grief he had carried for 6 years. A new layer underneath it now, an understanding of just how much she had sacrificed to keep him safe from a family that had once decided he was a problem to be paid off and erased. "I'm not angry at you," Marcus finally said, and he meant it, though it surprised him to hear himself say it out loud. "I'm angry at a system that let a scared young woman disappear with a baby and called that a solution. You didn't do that to us. Your father did." 3 days later, the story had already started moving through the building in the careful, deniable way these things always do. No official announcement, just enough whispered conversation in elevators and hallways that by Thursday morning, everyone on every floor knew exactly who the new face beside Richard Cole was. The board called an emergency meeting, the same kind of meeting Richard had shut down on the very first day, but this time he did not avoid it. He walked into that room with Marcus beside him and laid out, plainly and without apology, the full truth of who his son was and what role, if any, he would eventually have in the company his grandfather had built on the backs of choices like the one that had sent his mother running in the first place. Some board members were cold, a few were openly skeptical, asking pointed questions about inheritance and shares and what this meant for the Halberd partnership moving forward. But Richard answered every question without flinching, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he did not feel like he was protecting a company. He felt like he was protecting a son. Marcus did not take a seat in that boardroom, not that day, and not for a long while after, because despite everything that had changed in less than a week, the thing he wanted least in the world was to be handed something he had not built himself. He told Richard plainly that he would take the time to know him, slowly, as a father, before he ever let himself think about titles or shares or anything that came with the family name. And Richard, to his quiet surprise, did not argue with him about it. He simply nodded and said that was exactly the kind of answer he had hoped his son would give. Marcus still drives the same truck. He still picks his daughter up from school every day at 3:15. But on Sunday afternoons now, there is a standing reservation at a small restaurant near the river, a table for 3, where a man who spent 26 years searching finally gets to sit across from the family he almost lost forever, learning, one ordinary Sunday at a time, how to be a father to a grown man who never once asked him for anything except the truth. If this story moved you even a little, if it reminded you that the people we walk past every single day might be carrying something we will never fully understand, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, not for me, but for every story like this one still waiting to be told, because somewhere out there right now, someone is sitting in a waiting room just like Marcus was, with no idea their whole life is about to change, and they deserve to have their story heard too.